Welcome to Outer Space, International Arts and Class Struggle Podcast.
On this week's show, going deep into the process, part 3 of an interview with Mike Haas on the question of games. In the space station this week, we have Paul Paranoid, and music this week from Peter Iannone with a track called Randu Tap. Hi, I'm Rob McDonald, the host of Outer Space International Arts and Class Struggle podcast. Today we've got an old guest come back, Mike Haas. Hi, Mike. How you doing?
Doing fine.
Good stuff, man. Good stuff. Well, we're going to talk again for the third time about games, or develop the discussion that we're having around the question of games, art and creativity in general. So in the first... Well, actually, what I should do is rewind a little bit because people are just turning up. Who are you, Mike? And we ought to give you a little introduction. Maybe I know who you are because you've done 3 interviews now. But just to say, Mike is from Boston in the US. He's based in Barcelona. He's a collage artist, an artist in general, an educator, and a board game designer. That's about right, isn't it, Mike?
That covers all the bases so much.
Yeah, cool, man. Sorry for that little rewind, but can't always remember everything first time out. So we're going to do another little rewind. I just want to, for people that are listening, we've done 2 other shows with Mike, and they're worth listening to maybe first. You know, I'm not saying turn it off, but maybe the first 2 will give a background to what we're going to discuss today, because we had a discussion, first of all, on what are board games, what are games in general, actually, and then we developed into board games, which is your speciality, and we kept it defined there, and we defined a number of things that we thought games were and how they related with human beings. You know, we talked about lots of stuff, including Monopoly, I seem to remember. But we gave a very sort of basic of what games are and how they interact with humans. The second show we did, which is still buzzing around in my mind, is we did a discussion around gamification and how games are used, the model of games and what they do gets used in modern life, because the idea of how a game works, like what we discussed in the first show, is being understood and is being used. And on that, I just wanted to share with you, Mike, a little sort of experiment I thought I did, because it was buzzing around my head about gamification and how, you know, it's interacted. And I think I told you that, you know, I hated Twitter, and I hated it because I don't know how to play it. You know, I'm quite good on Facebook, well, relatively. Anyway, I put out some posts on Facebook, which were advertisements for this little series, you know, and I said things like, anybody liking this post will get a prize, you know, gamification, creativity podcast coming soon in October. And I thought, that's pretty clever, Rob. You understood exactly what Mike explained. You know how many likes I got?
How many?
Yeah.
Ooh, ouch! That hurts.
Yeah,
That hurts.
Yeah, I thought, okay, so I haven't caught the wind, you know. So I did another one on my personal Twitter this time, and on this one, I also talked about this show, and then I said, so I need to know, am I dull or are my posts really boring? And I said, which is it, players? You know, again, trying to be clever about gamification. Guess how many likes I got?
Is it 0 again?
Okay, so I still don't know how to play Twitter. And just for listeners now, this show's going to go out considerably later, probably, because we've recorded 3 in a row. We're not going to put them out consecutively. We're going to spread them out a little bit. So have a look at our Twitter, people, because at the moment we have 320 people who like us, who follow us. They only really follow us because I followed them. I did that that kind of startup number thing. Okay,
Part of the game.
and we've had one post which quite a lot of people have liked because it's on one of the shows of the previous series, but not that many. I think about 15 people. But have a look now. So maybe it's a month or so later. Have a look now and see whether I've learned how to play the game or not. Anyway, sorry for that long introduction, Mike. I just thought we would mess a little bit with the audience. I'd like to see if they're interacting or not. I'm not even going to give them the Twitter address. That's how complicated I am.
They should find it.
No, it'll be in the description, obviously, people. Okay, so Mike, sorry, I've rambled a bit. So we're going to talk today about games as an entertainment versus, I would say, games as a service. Now,
Right.
when we first did our pre-chat on this, I was like, that doesn't sound very interesting. And then as I've got to do these podcasts with you, I'm starting to get it. Okay. Now I'm quite interested to see where we're going to go with this one. So first of all, let's give some definitions, shall we? So games as entertainment. I think that's obvious, but maybe I'm being like, you play a game to be entertained, don't you? It's like the words kind of work. But what would you mean by games as entertainment?
For me, when I think about games as entertainment, I'm thinking primarily in terms of like games or an experience meant to be consumed and finished, and then to move on. It has a clear beginning, middle, and end.
Okay. So in that sense, a bit like the board games or a bit like playing cards or, can it mean other things as well, though?
Yeah, well, so this actually touches on to an element of game theory, which is a whole world of things that we don't need to talk about because it's mostly mathematics.
Okay.
But there is this concept of a finite game and an infinite game.
Okay, interesting.
And the
finite and infinite. So now we're getting into proper outer space shit.
Proper stuff.
Okay.
And so a finite game is a game with a specific, clearly understood objective. And once you reach that objective, the game is over. Like going to college, your objective is to graduate. And once you graduate, college is over. Unless
you went to college so you didn't have to get a shit job and you could just stay there forever.
And then that's another thing where there's an imbalance between who's playing what game, and then it's a very interesting conversation for another time. And then an infinite game is a game in which the core objective of the game is to continue playing that game. So you're not really pushing to reach an objective. You're just playing in a way that allows you to continue theoretically forever.
Okay.
So
give us a couple of examples of both of those, because it's, like you say, it's game theory stuff, and we're getting really deep into this stuff now.
Yeah.
But so give us an example of what would be that people would know, maybe of a finite game.
Of a finite game, of one that people would know. I mean, almost, I would say like 98% of board games are finite games, right? You put it out, you play the game, someone wins, you put the game away. Mm-hmm. One example of an infinite game for within the board game world would be Dungeons and Dragons, for example. People who are really into Dungeons and Dragons don't play it just to get to the end of the dungeon. They play so that their character can continue throughout.
I've seen these geeky friends of mine who sit around a table, including you, who sit around a table with some beers, maybe if they're lucky, and they would get maybe they'd have cards with it, maybe they'd just have a book, maybe they wouldn't even have that, and they would basically create a surreal world.
That's right.
Is that the kind of thing, sort of?
That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. That's sort of like the board game play side of it. And then there's another side of it, which it has more like real world consequences in terms of the game theory. It's sort of like one example that I heard that sort of clarified it for me very clearly was the US war in Afghanistan is an example of an imbalance of two players in that game. The US is playing the game to beat terrorism. They have a clearly a stated objective, air quotes there, obviously. And they think that once they win, they will leave, and that's the end. And the insurgents, the people in Afghanistan, are playing an infinite game to continue living in Afghanistan. And you have that imbalance there, which has trapped both sides, basically.
Okay, so that's an interesting political analysis of the games. I would throw in just one on the politics side of it, though, is on the war against the war against terrorism or something like that, or going to Afghanistan is very much about America imperialism having a bogeyman that they can constantly point to at home. So actually, an element of the ruling class in America might like a continuous war because they have a continuous terrorist enemy. So maybe they start as an element of them playing the infinite game.
That's right. And that's where you get into game theory, where it's like games within things, within schemes, and it's a whole.
So that's interesting because we're talking about games here, not as the board game, but actually for right through the spectrum. Because I was just thinking, we talk about board games, but do we mean football or do we mean this as well? And actually, do we mean all of life?
That's pretty much that's sort of like the core of like where my interest in games has like found itself, is that it's everywhere.
And I think that's the reason to discuss it on this show, because it is, we are talking about, when we say class struggle, we mean life, and for most of us, life is a class struggle, and for art and creativity. So yeah, I mean, it kind of makes sense to make that draw out this sort of wide understanding. I mean, is there any sort of other examples you can think of as an entertainment sort of game that you would make sense to explain the idea a bit more?
So there's one game that I wanted to discuss in the last episode for gamification, which is a game that I love called Gris, which Gris is Spanish for gray. And it's a game by an independent game developer studio here in Barcelona, actually. And it's a game that deals with the themes of mental health and recovery and it's based on that, mental health and recovery, and sort of pushing yourself through a crisis, really.
Yeah.
And it's done in a way that is so beautiful and elegant that I wanted to talk about it during the gamification because it sort of flips the idea of what we were talking about on its head, which was using game mechanics to create sort of like real world value or real world concept of value. And there's a couple of moments in the game, a couple of specific mechanics where part of it is where you need to learn how to fortify yourself against a blowing wind. Just this constant push. And it's about learning how to like physically take up space and physically like stand your ground. And it does it in a way that makes it actionable. And I think this is sort of like really where the important difference between games and movies or games and books are, for example, is like you create a moment of you teaching the player how to deal with this, and it becomes an actionable part of that player's. They
become a player. I mean, this series that we're in, this has been a lot of theatre, in it. So it's almost like being an actor in the theatre itself. You're playing.
You're directly engaged in learning this and activating it, and being it. And I think the reason it is so impactful, I believe, is that it has a clearly defined end. You do eventually, spoiler alert, recover.
So if you start this game depressed, you come out of it fucking happy. Yeah? Is that more or less how it works?
That's pretty much how. I mean, like,
that's the
very
objective
abstracted.
of
It's
the
very
game.
Beautiful. But I think if you ever are looking for an example of game as art, that is as clear as an example as I could ever give you.
Okay. Well, we'll put a link to it in the description, I think, because I think it sounds like a worthwhile example, and back to the gamification, but also for this games as an entertainment explanation. It sounds like it's one that's not necessarily about exploitative tricks. It's about mutual aid tricks, if that makes any sense.
Right. Well, you buy the game, you've done that, and then you play the game. It is a singular and defined scope, and then it's over. Okay. And then you go on with your life, thinking about the game because it's so beautiful.
That's games as an entertainment in a beautiful way, and as an example. But that's like the finite thing, right. And you can obviously have infinite games as well as that are entertainment. But we started off at the top of the show talking about games as entertainment versus games as a service. Now, right. When I heard the word service, I was thinking, well, what does that mean? Like a cashier or something, or somebody who, or you play a game and then a waiter comes around with some drinks or something. I wasn't quite sure where we were going with that statement. So do you want to give us a bit of an idea what games as a service means?
Yeah, games as a service is kind of, unfortunately, mainly an economic model for games.
Okay.
And it sort of has come about with the inclusion of technology and the internet into gaming culture, which is basically a player pays a subscription or some kind of, or is sort of clued into the game in a constant way. And the game just continues to develop and continues to get new content, and you're paying for a theoretically endless gaming experience.
So this is an indefinite game, generally speaking.
That's right.
Or always speaking, and often on internet, and therefore we're talking more video games and board games. Am I right with that? Because I've now got this vision of my geeky friends with all sitting around the table, playing their Dungeons and Dragons Infinite game, creating their reality, and then I see this big fat capitalist bastard coming in, going, right, I'm going to make some money out of these lads. Let's set up something that they get drawn into. I mean, I'm seeing the evils of it. Would that be a way of looking at it?
And I would say that probably the most well-known example of a live infinite game as service is World of Warcraft.
Okay, so explain that a little bit.
Which is a game that came out, I don't have the date with me right now. It's a game that came out several years ago, maybe a decade ago, or two now. Anyway, doesn't matter.
Long
time ago. Anyway, getting caught up on that. Where you create an avatar based on this sort of mythical world of Warcraft, and you inhabit a living, breathing ecosystem of players and monsters and quests and gold and all that things.
So
and you're
real
basically
people join you online, and that's the thing.
You're basically living out Dungeons and Dragons experience online with strangers or friends.
Yeah. So that's that. But that is games as a service? That's where that comes.
So the game as a service is that you don't necessarily buy the game as we're used to it. You download the game and then you pay a monthly subscription to it. The idea being that every couple of months, the developers insert new material. There's events every once in a while. There's things associated with Christmas and Halloween, and they sort of like to, create. The good thing about it is it creates a real sense of community if it's done well, and the negative side of it is that it creates what can be a very predatorial method of gamification, really, where you're trying to sort of extract money.
So it's like a virtual reality that people can create and get involved inside, lose themselves in. I mean, I just again had one of these little visions. I seem to be having visions today of the because I'm a 1980s teenager, we used to talk about people in the 60s, like the hippies. They went to the mountains in India, and when Vietnam was on or something like that, and they got lost and they stayed there. Nobody ever told them it was over, and they were just forever in their little bubble. Now, I got this imagination that there's a generation of kids that are lost in their little bubble of their games in service, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
With that.
So what happens with games like World of Warcraft and other open live games like these is that, especially in the beginning, there was a lot of controversy around people who became like really truly addicted to being in that space. Like really could not take care of themselves because they were so enveloped by the world that had been created that they couldn't leave it. And that's sort of where gaming and gamifications and games as a service all sort of created this kind of unholy mixture of
narcissistic capitalist world online.
Because what
dragon
happens
occasionally,
is because you have like a really rich and like it's a good game. It's like a really rich, engrossing world. It has it had some very unfortunate mechanics that hooked players in. It had a predatorial sort of way of going in, sort of teasing money out of players, and then sort of created sort of a perfect storm of behavior modification. They have since addressed that as a company, and they've created incentives for players to leave and get out, and like there are ways that you can reduce the harmful effects of what's happening here. But it is in some ways out of the developer's hands.
Yeah, so it's a bit like what's the film Terminator. I'm thinking the game is getting in control of people's minds, it's taking over the world. I mean, how this is an old game we're talking about. Yeah, this is something we're not talking about something new here. But what's the situation now with this? Because things have evolved since the beginning of this game.
Yeah, well, so what we have now is sort of the explosion of live mobile games. Games like Candy Crush, games, Fortnite. These games where, generally speaking, they're free to download and they're free to play. But if you want the edge, or if you want new skins or cool equipment or things that sort of like make you stand out as an individual, you have to pay. And they're not always cheap. And it's one of those ways where, and this sort of goes back to gamification, where it's like people have learned that if small little investments, small little like €1, €2, people are like, I can do €1, and then they forget about it and they go, I can do another €1, and then they go I can do €5. That's not a big deal. And then it turns into, at the end of the month, you spent €100.
Well, I've got a story on that. My granddaughter got old enough, really, that sometimes she needed to be able to contact us. So, being a good granddad, I bought her a cheap phone, purposely, not to be a very complicated phone, not that I had the money to buy a complicated one. So I got a cheap phone. She goes, "Oh, has it got games on, Grandad?" First thing she asked. I said, "I don't think so. Don't be silly. I bought you the shittest game I could, the shittest one I could from Argos in England, blah, blah, blah." Anyway, being of that generation, she finds the game. I was like, "Oh, wow. Really? I have a look. Oh, yeah, look, it's free, Grandad." But, "Oh, yeah, great." And being a good granddad and worried about my granddaughter and not very near her, so I always wanted her to be able to ring me abroad, and if necessary, so I put quite a bit of money on the phone. I thought I'd be quite clever, and lo and behold, within a month, all the money spent, and I was like, "You got 3 fucking calls? How did you manage that? You haven't hardly rang me like you were meant to." And then I find out that it's the game. I don't know which game it was, but actually it was also wasn't. I don't know if she didn't. I think she probably knew what she was doing, but maybe she didn't. But she racked up. Basically, she used all the credit up in 5 minutes, to continue playing the game?
Well, and that's a conversation that's being had right now because the industry knows that regulation is coming. The industry knows that people are concerned. The industry knows that there's pressure against it. So they are taking measures to sort of proactively deal with that kind of thing. But it is something where the generation that's coming up now is in a really weird spot where they have the technological literacy to do almost anything that they want to with the phones, but they don't have the emotional or the probabilistic understanding of exactly what they're buying into. So it creates this really vicious capitalist cycle of like, I'm just going to give you money.
This generation, it's an interesting discussion because, I'm old enough to have a dial telephone person. I'm the first generation of home computer children. So this is my generation. When as I die, I'll look back and I would be the first phase of information technology person. Yeah. But what you're kind of saying here is that this generation has got to the stage, which I know is true, that they're interacted with the technology automatic. Even some that don't know. Although I think the COVID thing's thrown up some twisters on that in school education, but that's another subject. But you're saying that they're now primed for full exploitation with this kind of thing.
That's right. And then it comes down to where, and this is sort of true for any kind of entertainment industry, I guess, but where is the moral lines for the industry to regulate itself along with the understanding that there are some people that don't have the capacity to regulate themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think we can safely say that capitalism cannot regulate itself. And it has the habit of being in a money-making world. I think, that comes down to, there's other stuff I think we need to, after this podcast, we'll go into video games a bit more because I think there's a big world there of unionization of workers, who controls the industry, and for socialists, what would be, maybe it's something we could develop in another podcast. How should games be? Should they be digging into your head, getting a quid out your pocket? Maybe we've already started that discussion, but it would strike me that what we've got here is with the games as a service is this is the sharp end's not the right word, but this is the clear end of how capitalist exploitation happens within the gaming industry.
Well, and it's an important conversation to have because the truth is that it is also the door to the greatest form of accessibility for games for the widest group of people, the widest audience. Because like I said, it's like the vast majority of these games that we're talking about, like games as a service right now, is they are free to play. You can download those and spend no money, and you can continue to play those games and never spend any money. I've got several on my phone. I've been playing them for months. I go slower than most people because I'm not paying for the boosts, but there's no reason that you need to pay for it if it's done well. And I like to think that I have a certain literacy of how they monetize and how they design, I don't need to pay, so I'm playing games for free.
Yeah. There's all sorts of questions coming out of this. One is accessibility was one word that you said. The other one was that sometimes the very worst of capitalism is the very next step of socialism, if you know what I'm saying. So the worst thing that capitalism does, worst exploitation, it actually leads, if done slightly different, to beautiful things that humans could have access to, and you can have a very futuristic and positive outlook about how technologies could be used. But then you're also talking about this idea of if you're clever, you can find your way through it. Now, that's the bit I just want to sort of go on a little bit, because can you? Can you be clever with these things? Are you being clever, or are they being cleverer than you by dropping in? Is there like little socialized messages in there? Is there like, a can of Coke on, or even I've done it now. Not Coca-Cola, not Pepsi. Fucking don't buy any of them. Bad for your health. Sorry, I mentioned them. That kind of thing. Is there is that going on with these kind of games that are free? Is there another? Because capitalism doesn't do nothing for free.
Well,
anything that's for free there's a reason normally, isn't there? What would you say the reason was?
Generally speaking, in game, like in the actual gameplay, there's very little of that kind of like, known sports drink. I might want to drink that now. But what they do have is advertisements. So you'll go through a couple levels, and in the middle of level, you have to
bit like podcasts
advertisements.
Do.
Yeah, or like YouTube or something like that.
And if you see an advert, let me say this. If you see an advert before this podcast in any way, do what I do. Look up at the ceiling and put your fingers in your ears. And even if it's something you want, don't look at it.
Yeah. No, but it's sort of like, that's what I'm sort of talking about is like, once you understand the different monetizing routes, it could be advertising, it could be micro interactions, it could be paying for the game up front, it could be data mining. There's other, if you're playing a free game that doesn't ask for money and it doesn't show advertisements, you should double check what their
spyware
policy is for like using your information, because that's sort of where things start.
So they might be taking you, who you are, where you are, learning. Well, there must be another side to this though, Mike, because there always is. There's always an opposition. There's always a fight back. It's not always obvious, and gamers are quite often hip and cool. Not necessarily good politically, but what jumps in my head is there like in computing, is there like common grounds? Is there like a left field? Is there like an alternative making of games that don't do these things? Is there anything like that out there? Is there an opposition? Is there an organized gamers for socialism kind of thing going down?
Well, it's not as far as I know, not to that extent. I mean, there's a large group of technology users in general who are really into open source, which is, you create material, create intellectual property. It's open for everyone. Anyone can download it and use it and change it however they want. That hasn't quite made it into the game industry yet. There's a couple of open source game engines for game creation, which is cool. But in terms of like the gaming world as an industry, it's not quite picked up steam yet. There is a general understanding of there are hard lines though, for the general public. For example, there's a company, EA, Electronic Arts. It's a big company.
EA Sports. It's in the
EA
game.
Sports
it's in the game.
Is one part of EA as a larger tech company.
They used to do the football game, eh? That's how.
Yeah, exactly. They have a ton of sports games. They also handle most of the Star Wars intellectual property. And there's a game that came out a little while back, Battlefront, I hope I'm getting that right, where it was a game, it was very expensive, big, huge publicity. They charged $60 to get the game, and then inside of that game there were also microtransactions so that you would have an edge on the players. And people were livid, and the gaming community in general sort of rose up and trashed EA's respectability and reputation, trashed it. And since then, EA has done a lot to sort of recover their lost reputation based on that.
Right. So in terms of like demonstrating and striking, there's reputation smashing.
There is,
which is good. Which is one way to fight back.
Which is one way to fight back. Unfortunately, the gamer community is pretty segmented. There's a huge there's a big left-leaning, more sort of gender ambiguous, open community that's really into the indie gaming world these days. And then there's still a very like toxic masculine machisto kind of crap.
So that the social questions, if you like, the battle that's happening in society. I mean, there's multiple battles always taking place in society, and gender and race are two very big ones at the present time. Always have been, always will be.
Exactly.
But there's not. I suppose what I was kind of looking for was a bit of an ideological war. Maybe that's not being completely galvanized at this stage, and maybe that's connected to the points I made earlier about unionization within the game industry. A growing consciousness in society in general would probably affect that. I was wondering whether these cool geeky kids were going to rise up or something. That's what I'm waiting for.
I think that there is something to be said now that we have, I was saying, a sort of a more accessible world of gaming and a more open space in terms of design and playing. You do see an equalization of representation. It's really slow, and it's way beyond. It's way behind where it should be.
Unless it sells, they don't put it.
Unless it sells, it doesn't make it. People just don't know about it. And then what happens is the industry is taking very small steps. There is really interesting things happening in the indie designer space.
Yeah. Is that a spaceship building in the background at your house?
Yeah, neighbors taking off.
That's what happens when you record live. Sorry, Mike. Go on.
No.
I thought it was the outer space station. I thought it was Jonas saying your time is up.
There is some really interesting things happening. Yeah. It's not an organized movement. It's just interesting things.
And I think maybe what we're talking about here, it would be interesting if there was a bit of an organized thing going on, or even a tendency towards a sort of thing. But obviously these things do reflect society struggles in general. And I think probably what the companies are doing, they're just they're going with trends, aren't they? Because if you don't follow the trends, you don't sell your items. I mean, you can see that. It's like a Che Guevara t-shirt, isn't it, or something like that. If it's something, an image that looks cool, it's got a cleanish reputation, and Che Guevara has got a clean reputation in the sense on the left, whereas maybe Stalin doesn't have quite such a clean one. Doesn't deserve it either, of course. So yeah, it's a bit of marketing skills that they're bending towards rather than anything else. But obviously, the people they consume, that's us. We can do something about that. So, well, why don't we leave it there, hey, Mike? I think we've got more to discuss. I think we've covered 3 episodes now, and we're just scratching the surface on this issue. I think it's a big one.
Now you're finally starting to understand.
Yeah, I'm getting it a bit. I mean, I'm a bit old school, but the more we talk, the more I realise that I'm really hooked into all this as well. I don't necessarily, I'm not on the computer playing a game all the time or whatever, but I did the EA Sports one. I did the football game. I had sore thumbs from that kind of thing. I did play Pac-Man. I'm original Space Invaders generation, so I know my stuff, but I'm learning fast about some of the deeper issues. And I think we should go into it more. So if you're up for it, Mike, we'll have you back.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, cool. You take care now.
You too.
Okay, then let's make our way up to the space station where we should be finding a certain Mr. Paul Paranoid. Are you there, Paul?
Hey, Rob, I'm receiving you.
Hey, well, good to hear you, my friend. Good to hear you. So, are you all right? Is everything well up there? Are you keeping it nice and clean?
It's all right. It's chilly, but that's normal for space.
Well, listen, Paul. I've got something to start us off on this one, because I think this is the third one we've done with Mike, and I want to explain something, because we've recorded all the shows with Mike together, and we did it over I think we did it over a 2-week period, and then we put games 1 and games 2, we put that out in the second series. This one's going out in the third series, and quite some time later. And interestingly enough, we're now doing the space station sometime after again, whereas with the other two we did straight away. So we've had sort of a bit of jump in how we've recorded them, and in especially number 2 and in the beginning of this one, I talked a lot about when we talked about gamification and all the issues that Mike raised today. In this one, we talked about all the liking and all the interactions that games do to you, and whether it's socially good or bad, and what effect it has on people, and this kind of stuff. And I think I said at the top of the show here, have a look at my Twitter, see how we've done. And something really quite strange happened. And I think now that we've come to record this for the third series, I think we've got to go through it a little bit, because it's a bit of a human story that we went through ourselves, or I did. So what happened is, when we came to put out games 2, we put it out at the end of series 2, but it had been recorded sometime before. And it just so happened that as we put it out, I was going through a break. I needed to, not a breakdown, but it was a little bit. But I was mentally and physically exhausted. And I, in my normal fashion, I'd overdone things, and I'd been quite unwell physically for a while. And I decided that I really needed to take a break. And so I stopped all my life's activities. I spoke to my partner. I'm saying I'm going to take a month off. It's going to run into Christmas. I basically did a sort of health break. It was very needed. Now, what I didn't realize is that I had to come off social media. And so this is the bit of the story. At the same time as it was time to put games 2 out. So I put games 2 out, but only allowed myself to go onto Facebook on Saturday mornings to put the show out. And what was bizarre about this is that I had to really get a break, because I started to try and have a break and I couldn't do it with everything coming in on me. So I had WhatsApp groups, I had Facebook messaging, I had Twitter, and I just thought, you know what? I can't fucking deal with all this shit. I actually need a break. And what's fascinating about it is, I think the interviews with 1, 2, and 3 that we did with Mike over the first 2 weeks was sometime before this, was about a month before this hit me. And I think all the discussions, because I'm not a gamer, and I do know about gamification, and I do know, there's some negative sides to some social media stuff, but I don't think I fully comprehended what had happened. And I think having the discussions with Mike gave me a subconscious idea to get the fuck out for a bit. And I tell you what, I did. I deleted Facebook. I deleted Twitter. All my Instagrams, everything was deleted off from my phone. I came out of WhatsApp chats and all this kind of stuff. And actually, it was fucking brilliant. It took me a while. It was like giving up cigarettes. I haven't smoked for many years now, but I used to. But after about a week of not smoking or of not being on social media, my life started to blossom in different ways. And I'm not doing this because we're doing the show or making an exaggerated point. I needed the break. Yeah, that was a separate question, which, we won't go into in details on the show. But actually coming off those social medias allowed me to listen to music, to go for walks, and to have different social reactions with people. I stopped doing these kind of Zoom. We do this on Zoom. I stopped doing this kind of stuff. We didn't do anything in that period. And what I'm saying is, this was a real eye-opener, because all the projects I run about 3 or 4 projects, all of them have their own Facebook, their own Twitter, their own this. And I've spent my time tick, flicking, saving, sharing, trying to get a like, trying to do this, trying to do that. And I realized that I'd got, even though I think I'm somehow immune to it because I'm doing a podcast on it, or I'm politically aware, and all the things that Mike was talking about, you know, us being educated about these things. I'd even done a podcast with him, and I hadn't realized it had actually been quite a significant part of my mental exhaustion, you know, which led, you know, to potentially being unwell. So I don't know if it's that interesting thing to do a space station on, but for me, there's loads we could talk about what Mike's just said. But I don't know, that I wanted to bring that to you and to the podcast, that it was quite sharp that not having that shit in front of my face was very good. Having said that, I had a great rest and I came flying back, and now I'm on it more than before. And so there's this it's like a fruit machine addict who's come back, but he's all right now. I'm all right. Don't worry about me. I'm fine because I've had a rest. I don't know. I think that touches on a lot of the points that we've talked about with gamification, with all the different things that Mike's raised today. I don't know. What's your take on it? What's your thoughts on that?
I'm quite a big fan of the science fiction author Philip K. Dick, who you'll have seen several adaptations of his work into movies, like Total Recall, Blade Runner, A Scanner Darkly was adapted. And he was a terrific, kind of slightly off the wall, great speculative thinker who wrote kind of like airport novel science fiction, you know, but he was just so brilliant that he transcended the form. And he, in one of his books called Lies Incorporated, and also it's called another title is The Unteleported Man. A guy sets himself up to make a journey without any kind of sleeping equipment to prove a point, to prove that there is something untoward going on at this destination point that people have been traveling to by teleportation. He does it on foot, if you like, and by on foot I'm in a spaceship. And somebody sits down with him before he starts the journey, and his sleeping equipment is confiscated by the corporate enemy that they're up against. So he's going to have to do the whole 15-year journey, like in real time, you know, right, rather than. And he's given a warning before he leaves. The guy that set him up to do this gives him a diary. The guy that tries to talk him out of it, and he says, "I just want you to keep a record of how you cope. It'll be interesting for people to read about a mind in deterioration at the other end." This complete, like,
that's all you're saying is going on with me here. He's like, we're going on this podcast journey.
I'm saying the opposite. It's absolutely fascinating that in science fiction, which is all about the future and predicting the future, Philip, and I'm quite aware that there's an element of this where he would be traveling further and further away from frequencies. I know that, but the point that was being made there was what happens to a mind when it's in complete isolation. And it's a science fiction book. And the world we're living in is one where complete isolation is something you have to work to get, because you had to work at it. You had to kind of like pull up the drawbridge. You had to kind of like seal up the doors. You had to like shutter the windows, because everywhere you looked, the internet life, the internet social model was clamoring to get into your head. And that was driving you mad, not isolation. And I know that we're talking about two extremes here, and one of them is particularly extreme, the one I brought to the table. But I just find it fascinating that in a science fiction novel, they posited the absolute opposite of what our problem is. Who'd have thought that the problem we were going to have was that we were going to lose touch with reality, not by being isolated from one another, but by having over contact with one another.
I think you've hit something very interesting here, and because it was the end of the COVID year, wasn't it? You know, and the COVID year has been about isolation, and it's also been about the intensification of internet interrelationships. You know, and just while you're saying that sort of, and within that, I suppose what happened is I had overload. Personally speaking. And so it's like, I don't know. It's an interesting thing that this, because we're talking about games and its interconnection with life, and I think that was this little journey that I went on with doing this show on this podcast, these 3 shows, and that thing. Last year felt like a science fiction novel anyway, didn't it? Let's be honest. I mean, it was a bizarre year, and maybe because the way that we think as humans, we had a restart button on January the 1st. It's false, because December 31st is exactly the same as the next day. But we symbolically, just like artworks, we symbolically make the next day something different, and I did that. I did a restart button, and allowed myself to go back to the game drug. What about you though? I mean, do you have what relationship do you have with that kind of isolation game kind of thing? I mean, you're not so much as, I'm a social media junkie, not because I want to be, but because of the projects I do. So this has been like my illness, and not illness is the wrong word. You know what I'm saying? I
have a kind of a smattering of what you do, and it's partly because my own health and my own mental health and physical health are so compromised. As I think we've touched on it a few times before. That I know not to be too drawn in too deep. So I don't do it for work. I really sympathise with you, because I can hear the kind of sort of road burn that you're kind of talking about there, just a kind of erosion of a sense of calm, because you're constantly on. And I think that's the real danger with the social media thing. And is it a game? Well, yeah, it is. We've kind of brought the office into the home, and we have gamified it along the way. It's kind of fun, isn't it? Playing. I've noticed with something like Twitter, being depressed, I love checking in with Twitter and seeing, and it worries me about the narcissism of this, looking to see if people have responded to my witticism. What am I doing? But the truth is, when you're depressed and you're low motivation, anything that raises your spirits and gets you out of bed, although quite frankly, I tend to stay in bed. And I think that's the problem.
You're not in bed now, are you?
I'm sitting on my bed, but
ladies and gentlemen, we present Paul on his bed.
Whether or not these gaming sort of models, and I do think that social media is a game, really, and I think you joked about that right at the start when you started talking about Twitter with Mike. I think there's that, and then another side of it, which I think is maybe what you're getting at, is of course being ill and not being able to work. I have this terrible thing about how do I fill my time, because I'm not well enough to do things that are constructive. I desperately want to do constructive things, but my ability to apply myself is limited, and I can't let myself become ill. And that's something where, if you like, I'm always monitoring myself the way you started to monitor yourself for your break. So basically, I play a lot of games as entertainment. I'm quite, it's not unusual for guys in middle age to play games anymore. We are the gaming generation, But as I'm getting older, I'm starting to question it. It's played an incredibly important role in a part of my recovery when, as I like to describe it to people, too awake to sleep, not awake enough to do anything useful. Games are brilliant for that. I wish I didn't have the condition I do. I wish that I have a lot of things I want to achieve, but it's just not realistic at the moment, and it may never be realistic now. I'm just, I'm one of those people, if I push myself too hard, I get really sick, and then it can take weeks or months to get better. So I really hear what you were saying, and I commend you for catching yourself before you fell down that rabbit hole of,
well, I was a bit late, to be honest. I was a little bit late.
Yeah.
Well, no, you don't do things until you have to. But actually, the moral of the story is I did have a break and I did walk away from shit. Yeah. And it felt.
You still caught yourself. Imagine if you hadn't acted when you did.
Yeah. Well, the podcast would no longer exist.
Yeah. So indeed, and similarly, you see, I'm in danger. I pushed myself too far for too long a long time ago, and then I looked after my mum and all that sort of thing. So I've not had it's not been I don't do a podcast myself for the reasons that you managed to avoid. So good for you. I commend you for it.
Yeah, sorry. I just think it's quite interesting. This I don't really want to say this, but it's like the good or the bad of gaming or gamification, or the bad role or the good role that it plays, because it's definitely, and it started from the first show that we talked about games and its reflection in life, and that life is a game. There was a lot of this kind of thing. So what we've got here is a modeling on top of the real life, a layering, let's put it that way. And therefore we have to ask the question, what's good and what's bad? And what you've just said there about you playing games in the state that you can be in, that it plays this positive role. And Mike in just now, didn't he? He just talked about, this game that's designed to improve mental health,
yeah, definitely. That was a fascinating.
Yeah, so I mean, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a game designed for mental health. I suppose sometimes an escape is what you need. And I suppose what I did is I had an escape from the reality, and that's what games do, isn't it? And that's also what one pint of beer might do. The problem is I guess when you're addicted or something along those lines.
Well, where it is legitimate, I think where gaming is legitimate, and of course, at the end of the day, a game could be a game of pool, it could be a game of chess, it could be a sporting event, or it could be, playing, Call of Duty. I don't play Call of Duty, but I know a lot of people enjoy it. But basically, the thing that's really important is the sense of achievement one gets from testing oneself and winning some small victory. And it's not always as toxic as the competitive victory over an opponent, but let's face it, that can feel pretty good. Let's not pretend it doesn't. And I think if you're sick, or if you're socially disadvantaged, or you can't afford to go out and have a social life, or you're too shy to have a social life, or you're mentally ill, I think basically one thing that's nice about the modern medium of gaming is you get a kind of a simulated world in which you can get some dopamine hits, or you can get some victory moments. You might not be any good at playing pool in real life, but you might be amazing at playing, like Call of Duty or whatever it is. And there are some toxic sides to it, though.
So, I mean, just on this side, then you're talking like games in this sense could be a shot in the arm, and can get you.
For me, that's what it's about, and I enjoy. And sometimes I enjoy the interactivity with other members. Like I like games. My favourite game is one where online game. I play games offline as well, but my favourite online game is the one where you do. It's not actually Death Stranding, though I like that very much. But you do actually work as a small team, and you interact with each other. And you even resuscitate each other if one of you gets hurt, and you protect each other, and you fight for each other, and you do your best to fight the other team. And it can be very vicious. And for some reason, it's just for me, it's the perfect game, and it's just terrific. But the toxic side of it is sometimes I'll find myself thinking, my God, I'm like putting all this energy into this highly competitive, and let's face it, quite brutal, violent game. And I think there's a lot of that. And the beauty of Death Stranding is I think it's the advent of a new kind of paradigm of trying to sort of, in Death Stranding, the environment is your enemy, and you work together as, although not obviously, you don't see the other players, but you work together to overcome the environment. But in a lot of games, the most satisfying ones are when you are basically kicking the shit out of your opponents, and that is starting. Now I'm getting older. That is starting to bother me.
Yeah, well, it should, shouldn't it? I mean, I suppose what we're talking here is the negatives and positives of humanity. And we shouldn't really be surprised that during the whole discussions we're having on gamification, that those things come in and out of it all the time. And as we've mentioned a lot on this show, we'll say it one more time, the mechanisms of capitalism bring out the worst in humans as a general rule. And there is this fight for good shit going on, which I think is, some people might be able to argue that capitalism is connected to that too. I don't think so. But we end up, the reflection in games is the reflection of the life and the system that these humans live in. And I don't know. I mean, that's how I think that's how I sort of
you're right.
give a bit of conclusion to the things, and therefore I think one of the things that's hit me about Mike in all this was one comment he made, and that was the important thing is not whether the games are good or bad or whatever. It's that we're educated and we know about them. And I think this last show we did here, we went quite deep into that, all that infinite business, you know, and I've learned a lot in the last 3 shows, and I hope to learn a bit more from Mike in the future in the shows. Have you got anything to play us out with? Any thoughts?
I'm going to try and be concise. I'm sure we've used up most of our time already, but it's going to sound like a strange aside, but I'm very quickly knit it together. Just this week, I've had a really difficult week knitting together my financial situation, and I've been on the phone all week trying to sort out money issues. And it struck me today as I was on another day 3 of constantly using up all my waking day trying to figure out moving money around, fixing this problem, fixing that. And I thought to myself, you know what, all of this is like a massive distraction from what life's really for. And then I related it to, because I've been listening to Mike's interview with you again to prepare for this. I thought about that. I thought about everything Mike's been saying about gamification. I thought about our enjoyable journey into the Death Stranding world and how that was, and I thought everything seems to be a kind of a layering of distraction. Like we seem to have all of the problems of life is, believe it or not, a kind of a game. The whole issue about credit and debt, which I've been deep in this week, trying to sort of sidestep I've been having to sort of move money around to sort of like refresh 0% interest loans for 6 months and stuff like that. And it's just, everything's getting a little bit harder now after a year of COVID, you know, and by the skin of my teeth, I've managed to pull myself out of the fire of, you know, being in, you know, getting massive interest fees applied to me and stuff like that. But it's taking a lot of work. And I'm thinking, I'm applying myself to this and it's like a game. And then I stop that and I play a game, and then I stop playing the game and I go on Twitter. And I thought all of this stuff, it's like a foggy pane of glass, then another foggy pane of glass, then another foggy pane of glass, and on the other side of all this foggy glass is life. And what is it? And here's the question: are we keeping ourselves from life because we're afraid of what's really there, or are we being tricked into staying away from what's really there? And that's what I want to sort of posit. So I haven't got an answer.
I think that sums up quite a few things quite well, and I think we're going to carry on exploring, aren't we? And keep going through those panes of glass until we start to really uncover what's really going on out there.
I really want to.
This is like an episode of Mulder and Scully, this, isn't it?
But I think there's a lot for a lot of people in what you said about needing to take that break from social media, and for you it's also work.
Actually, I think what you said, Paul, having a break from that financial fucking trying to make ends meet shit, because it does feel like a nonsense game when you're on the phone and
it's all a bit
trying
toxic,
to sort this out. And you know, yours was a particular type, but you know, people are, you know, can I pay this bill? Can I pay that bill? You know, how do I balance this? And then some personal things happen, and then cousin's not very well, or it's just like, fuck me. You know, there's not a moment to sit down and actually look at the trees, you know?
That's right. And when I do go for a walk, and I have to walk because I've been told I need to go for a walk at least once every 3 days, like for my health, right? So, and it's very easy with mental illness not to look after yourself physically, but you get into middle age and you absolutely have to. And you do see the trees, and you do, like yesterday I saw the snow and everything, and I just thought, oh God, and I was listening, funny enough, I was listening to Mike's interview while I did it, and I think I was cheating a little bit, but it was fair enough, you know. But in a way that made me think all the more. But what I would say here is, I think there's a lot here in what you say about knowing, I was going to say with the financial thing, and this is the key thing, and this is not obviously fun. It's not playing Call of Duty or whatever. But you know, when you do finally make a kind of win a little victory, and you do manage to escape the kind of claws of the sort of the high interest fees because you've been clever enough, because you thought of an idea, you realize that you could move this money over here and did that. That's a dopamine hit. That's a victory. That's a feeling of like taking down your enemy that's been sort of stalking your team in the Last of Us factions online, you know. And so I just sort of saw it all come together, and I kind of want to thank Mike for bringing all this work to us, because he's kind of done. It's kind of, because you think games are silly before you really analyze it, and what Mike's done is he's given us permission to kind of go, no, it's not silly. It's not silly. Games are a mechanic, you know. I think that's what he's brought to us, you know.
I think you're right, Paul. I think I can hear Jonas turning up that volume.
Yeah, I know. I'm over time.
I would say to people, listen to all 3 shows together. Put on your headphones and do it while you're walking in the countryside or in the park or somewhere else. Do not sit in front of your computer listening to this show. Okay, so I'll see you later then, Paul. Yeah, I'll see you next week.
Take care, man, and take care of yourself. And everybody listening also, maybe take a break, you know, from social media.
Well, if you can, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. See you later.
Cheerio.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I really hope you enjoyed part 3 of our game series with Mike Haas. If you like what we're doing and want to support us, you can donate through our website. I will now play the song Rando Tap by Peter Iannone for you. Enjoy.
We hope you enjoyed the show. If you have something to say to us, then join our Facebook group or contact us at outaspace.com. That's outa-space.com. See you soon.